I feel like I didn't explain the Herodotus thing very well. So let me start again by saying this. There are four different types of people that Herodotus explains as Ethiopians in this book. The first one are Libyan Ethiopians. The second one are Ethiopian Ethiopians. The third one are Tecumseh Ethiopians. And the fourth one are Asian Ethiopians. These four groups that he is explaining are all round the Africa region, especially the Libyan Ethiopians. These four groups, by the way, are not necessarily separate. You can see that he also includes some Tecumseh Ethiopians as having wavy hair rather than it being the most coiled in the world. This could be expected because of the fusion between Yemen and Ethiopia. Now, let's go through this faster in a different way. Indians in India, clearly by Herodotus's assumptions, are not Ethiopians, according to him. Even the ones that look like Ethiopians to him are not Ethiopians, which those would be the people from the Andamanese Islands, which I'm guessing he didn't get a chance to see. Now, if we move forward with this and we spend a while talking about why is Herodotus so concerned with the different types of people around his area, well, he's describing people who belong to the tribes of Xerxes. And as you can see, Xerxes is concerned. And that's because Xerxes and Darius and all these other people who are basically the Persian Empire, the people belonging to the Persian Empire, what they're doing is they're charting their territories. Now, something else that he points out that is ignored by historians is that these people are being moved around, meaning that you can find Ethiopians in India, Ethiopians which are black Ethiopians from Africa. You can find them being stationed close to India to reinforce the Indians. Then you can find Indians stationed near Europe to reinforce the other people in that region. Then you can find the Egyptians stationed in Arabia. You can find the Egyptians stationed in India, anywhere, because the Persian Empire is one solid empire. This is the point of why Herodotus is stating this. He's not stating it because of, let's say, racism or because he wants to differentiate what the different races are. He's stating this because it's important to note that this person, the Persians, are basically in charge of a multitude of people. So, why did I bring up the fact that the Egyptians were laying people on the borders for about 3 years? Well, the reason is because, just like I wanted to show with the Persian Empire, these people do not stay in one spot. And 3 years for those people felt like they were abandoned, and then they moved away. Now, of course, the number that they gave, Herodotus gave, is 250,000. Now, it's possible that that number is widely exaggerated or undercounted. Who knows? But the point is that the assumption is that when you get called to duty, you go fight the war, but then you go back to where you came from. So these people wouldn't have stayed in that region. You know how I know? Because Herodotus states people who stay in different locations, where he goes, oh, for example, or he mentions the Egyptians that ended up in Europe, and he says they were abandoned by the Pharaoh over there, or they were stationed there and just stayed there because they look different than the Europeans and they look similar to the Egyptians. Then he turns around and says that some Egyptians were also abandoned the coasts or the perimeters of Egypt to go to Ethiopia. When they got to Ethiopia, that's when they made their move and became a army for the Ethiopians. But at no point does he mention any return to Egypt. At no point, in fact, he mentions a part where the pharaoh Semetek wanted to bring them back to Egypt, and obviously that call didn't work. They just carried on. And so we can assume that anyone who was stationed anywhere went there and back. Now, did they have kids there? I don't know. Did they? I don't know. But what we do know is that people back in the day, because of empire, were moving around. We also know that the Arabs that were once stationed in one location, based on Herodotus, found themselves moving from Egypt to all these other places and staying there. Herodotus says this, that there are Arabs that are on the outer perimeter of Egypt, but he says there that there are also Ethiopians amongst those Arabs. Not only that, he says that the Ethiopians and Arabs were marshaled with each other. And then in another verse, he says that the Indians and the Ethiopians, the Asian Ethiopians, were marshaled with each other, dressed alike. This is a very crazy visual. Like, try to imagine that in your head. That it seems like the most crisscross of nations ever. And you can see in the way that the Persians depict these various races, that they're actually proud of the fact that they have so many races under their arm, under their thumb. It's not something that they're doing or something that only Herodotus is exaggerating. Like, okay, Herodotus brings up all these races. What proof do we have that there are any other races in the Persian Empire? Well, we find Persian sources and even Persian statues that, and with writing, that prove that they had so many different people under their military. And now the question is, how would Herodotus, let's say the Persians just took over the Indians and left them in India, how would Herodotus know that they look like the Ethiopians, or the differences between the different smaller tribes and what they eat and what they not eat, saying that they don't even eat meat, which is a very crazy guess, especially given that that almost never happened anywhere else. What is it about this story? You know, the reason why I like to bring up Herodotus more than any of these other people, like I could bring up Romans who talk about this and all the others. The reason why I like to bring Herodotus is he's the first clear and straightforward person about the entire thing that was happening, and you can't really give him an agenda. What's his agenda for lying? What's his agenda for not telling the truth? Outside of people wanting it to be wrong, why would he be lying? And a lot of things he mentions, like, oh, I heard this. He doesn't even lie about the stuff that he says I heard. Even when he talks about the Garamantes, not the Garamantes, even when he talks about the Egyptians stationed in Europe, he says, I saw this myself before I heard it from others. He doesn't say I didn't hear it from others. He says I saw it first before I heard it from others. Before I go on about whether or not certain people were stationed in certain areas, I want to say one thing. First of all, there's like two tricks that we've fallen for over and over again that historians tend to use. And one is to try and give the genetic definition for what a black person is, which is these L, DNA, and all of that. And if you sway from that, if you go away from that, then they go, oh, those aren't black people. But in real life, anyone who kind of looks like a black person, has curly hair, has dark skin, broad nose, thick lips, things that are typically African, right? The same type of bone structure as Africans would be called an African. It doesn't matter, or would be called a black person. It doesn't matter what their DNA was. There's a reason why places like Papua New Guinea are called New Guinea after Guinea, the original Guinea in West Africa. There's a reason why places in the Middle East, people in the Middle East, were named after other black people from Africa. They like to do this thing where they separate what the word black is so that it doesn't mean what you think it means. I'll give you an example. Remember when Zahi Hawass said the ancient Egyptians are black, but they're not Negro? That tells you what the game is, what he's trying to play at. That even if we find 100% that they were melanated, even if we find 100% that they had curly hair, even if we find all of that, if their DNA leans more to Asian tribes, right? So, we're going to find this. Human beings are a vast species, and at some point we went from African to Asian. Then they can go, oh, it doesn't matter that they didn't look like anything like what people in the Middle East look like today. They're from Asia. When we all know that if they look like black people today, it doesn't matter what their DNA is, then they should be represented in that way everywhere, in recreations, in movies, in documentaries, in books, the way they're told that they physically looked like the Africans. But we play this game where they try to switch us on that, where we have to go, oh, unless they come out with a DNA of West Africans, then we can then accept them as Africans. This is why I don't play into the game of, you know, Egyptians went to West Africa and started the civilization there, because I know that's just another trick they play, because they want you to be the most extreme so they can easily debunk you. But luckily, we don't have to worry about that because we've already found at least one pharaoh, Ramses III, who had black African, West African like DNA. For the people who weren't around in my early videos, this is what I'm showing you. You can see that it's written Hawass et al. 2012. And this was a study that was done in 2021, I think. But you can see, this is a study, by the way. This is not a article, it's not a paper, it's not a newspaper. It's a study, a genetic um a genetic peer reviewed whatever study that is out that shows what the genetics of the Egyptians were. They didn't get the full genetics of the Egyptians. Keep that in mind, because some of the genetics were so degraded that you couldn't find certain things. But also, obviously, some of them were women, so they only show the female side of DNA. This was a man. The father-son pair, Ramses III, an unknown man, E. Pentuer, was found to have haplogroup E1b1a. That shows its highest frequencies in modern populations from West Africa at 80% and Central Africa at 60%. It is less than 10% amongst North Africans and nearly absent in East Africans, which is where it is hypothesized to have originated. Alternatively, an earlier origin of around 220,000 to 30,000 years before present was hypothesized in West Africa due to its very high diversity and frequency in that location, although the frequency of haplogroup E among contemporary Egyptians is 39.5%. That of the E1b1 subclade was only 1.4%. Now, let's go back to something that I was saying earlier. If genetically you have African DNA, then you're African. It means that 39% of contemporary Egyptians are African. Now, whether they claim that or not, that's up to them. All I'm saying is, why do can they be both non-African, meaning North Africans are non-African, and then African when they share genetic that we know started somewhere with the black Africans and they possess it today and they spread it across the Middle East. It also tells you how fusion made the modern Egyptians are. That they're not a singular group. They're not one genetic because you'll find European pieces here, you'll find Middle Eastern pieces here, and you'll find African pieces here. That tells you that they're not one group. Even though they try to pretend like, okay, there was the Egyptians, they were born, they're Afro-Asiatic, they stayed there, and the genetics didn't change till the end of time. So the guys we're looking at today are the same as the guys we're looking at back in the day, and that's it. Hey, guess what? If we look at the DNA of ancient Egyptians, it matches the ones today. Yeah, but the Egyptians of today don't even match the Egyptians of 200 years ago genetically. So what does that mean? You just told us they have an increase of sub-Saharan DNA. Was this increase present back in the day? According to this, yes. Well, if it is, which by the way, there is genetic studies that show that this DNA goes back 10,000 years ago in North Africa. That means, what does that mean? That means that what, they're Asian but African? When it comes to being black and when it comes to being African, it's all about appearance. Remember that. This map is absolutely perfect because it shows you that the highest frequency of these E clades, I mean, if you just look at it, it shows you that the highest frequency for these genetics hug Africa. From the north, it's just southern Europe, parts of Greece, parts of the Eurasian areas, the Yemenite areas, and going that way, right? You can see that this is a clear, it's almost got a clear place of origin, and then to move out. Now, keep in mind, this is a hypothesis. It's not fully proven where it came from, but the highest, the one that makes the most amount of sense, just like the Afro-Asiatic, is coming from East Africa somewhere. The reason why they don't say it comes from West Africa is because it's sort of, to some degree, would not make sense why these other where would these other things come from? Now, are these people not black? When they brought the DNA to these areas, what did they look like? If the E1B1A clade is about 20,000 years ago, how young are these other ones? Especially considering the fact that the way that those people looked like in the beginning has completely disappeared.